The night air in Redemption, Texas, carried more than just the scent of pine smoke and the coming frost. It was thick with a brewing hatred that tasted like rust on the tongue. A dozen torches slashed through the darkness, their flames dancing wildly in the wind, painting the faces of the assembled townsfolk in grotesque masks of shadow and light. These were not strangers. Elias Thorne recognized the blacksmith, the preacher's wife, faces he had known his entire life, now twisted into a singular expression of pious fury. At their head stood Deacon Miller, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon as his voice sliced through the night. The woman is a vessel of unnatural forces. She communes with beasts and hexes the righteous with a silent curse. Just behind the mob, leaning casually against a fence post as if observing a theater play he had written himself, Caleb Blackwood watched with a cold, satisfied smirk. His personal vengeance was now wearing the holy robes of the town's fear. From the cabin window, Cora watched them, her hand pressed flat against the cool glass. She could not hear the words, but she felt them, the sharp, jagged texture of their fear, the oily sickness of their certainty, a physical wave of malice that threatened to splinter the very logs of the house. Elias Thorne stepped onto the porch, his body a lone silhouette against the warm lamplight from within. He saw in their eyes the same terrible, unwavering conviction his own father once wore like a crown. Would he, to protect this silent girl, become the very thing he loathed? Would he answer their fire with a fire of his own and prove that a Thorne's only answer is violence? Or would he find a different kind of strength, one that didn't require a fist or a gun? In a world that fears silence, can a quiet love be loud enough to survive? Stay with us to witness this story of defiance and devotion. If you believe love's true language is heard by the heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the Wild West Love Story channel. The town of Redemption, Texas, in the blistering autumn of 1881, was a place held together by dust, whiskey, and the long, unforgiving memories of its people. The air itself seemed weary, thick with the lowing of cattle being herded into pens and the sharp, final crack of the auctioneer's gavel, a sound that sealed fates for beast and sometimes man. Elias Thorne kept to the shadows of the wooden awnings, his hat pulled low to obscure a face that was already a map of solitude. At 35, he was a man shaped more by the vast, silent landscapes of his ranch than by the company of others. He rarely came to redemption, for the name Thorne was both a legacy of power and a curse of violence in this town, a name his father had carved into the county's history with blood and ambition. Today, however, necessity had driven him from his fortress of solitude. A fence-line dispute had cost him a good horse, and he needed another to work his 200 acres of unforgiving red Texas clay. He was here for a simple transaction, a brief foray into a world he preferred to keep at a distance. As the long, brutal afternoon wore on and the livestock auction thinned, he moved toward the last corral, his boot heels making dull, rhythmic thuds on the packed earth. He'd spotted a bay mare earlier, ribs showing like a washboard under her hide and her flanks striped with the ghost of a whip, but there was a fire in her eyes that spoke of a spirit not yet broken by cruelty. It was a spirit he understood. That was when he saw her, a figure almost lost in the chaos. She stood just behind the corral gate, a girl no older than 19, tethered to her father by a length of dirty rope tied callously to her wrist. Her dress was torn, her feet were bare and caked with the same dust as the cattle, and her hair was a matted tangle that obscured her face. but it was her stillness in the midst of the noise and filth that arrested him. Her father, a shambling man reeking of cheap liquor and desperation, was trying to add her to a sale, hollering to the few remaining, uninterested men. "Got a dumb one here!" The drunk bellowed, his voice cracking. "Came out of my first wife, I think. Don't talk, don't hear neither. But she cleans, cooks, don't sass. Cheap!" A few men chuckled darkly. One spat a stream of tobacco juice near her bare feet. Elias felt a familiar disgust rise in his throat, a contempt for the casual cruelty of men, and he turned to leave. He wanted a horse, not a human complication. But in that moment, she shifted, and through the veil of her hair, her gaze found his. There was no plea for help, no hint of desperation. It was a look of startling, unnerving clarity, a silent acknowledgement of a shared loneliness that struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the look of a soul trapped, seeing another of its kind. The drunkard noticed his attention and stumbled toward him, yanking the rope. You got coin. Want the horse? She comes with it. Ain't draggin' her back to my place, not worth the dust on her toes." Before Elias could form a reply, a different voice, as smooth as oiled leather and twice as slick, cut through the air. "Well, well, a Thorne, always with an eye for acquiring new property. It's a family trait, isn't it?" Caleb Blackwood emerged from the saloon's swinging doors, flanked by two of his hired men. His tailored coat was clean, a stark contrast to the grime of the auction yard, and the smile on his face never once reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Buying up livestock, Thorne? Or just collecting strays to clutter that land my family used to water?" Elias's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze on the girl. He had no words for a man like Blackwood. He unfastened his coin purse, counting out the silver, enough for the horse, and pressed it hard into the drunk's greasy palm. "I'll take both." The laughter from Blackwood was low and predatory. "Generous. My family certainly remembers how the Thornes could be so generous with what wasn't theirs." He took a deliberate step closer, invading Elias's space, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was just over at the county clerk's office this morning. It's amazing what you can find when you start dusting off old family papers, old debts. The past has a funny way of catching up. Thorne, I'd make sure your fences are in order. All of them." The threat was unmistakable, a poisoned dart wrapped in civility. As Blackwood and his men sauntered back toward the saloon, the town's lawman, Sheriff Brody, stepped out from the cool darkness of his office across the street. He was a weary man, his shoulders stooped from the weight of a tin star that carried little real power. He watched Blackwood disappear, then gave Elias a tired, cautionary look. "You ought to be careful, Elias," Brody said, his voice just low enough not to carry on the wind. "Blackwood's been stirring hornets' nests all month, talking to lawyers, digging into things best left buried deep. He's not the type to forget an old grudge." Elias offered only a curt nod in reply. A warning was not help. He untied the rope from the girl's wrist and tossed it back at her stunned father, who was still counting the coins. He led the mare from the pen, the girl following a few paces behind with those same quiet, deliberate steps. As they reached his wagon, she stopped, waiting. He motioned for her to climb into the back, and she did, folding herself into a corner like someone used to being invisible. The long, silent ride back to his ranch was a journey through a landscape that mirrored the space between them. Vast, starkly beautiful, and profoundly empty. The crunch of the wagon wheels over the hard-pan road was the only sound. As a sudden jolt from a deep rut shook the wagon, a small object tumbled from the thin shawl she clutched around her shoulders. It was a little wooden bird, intricately carved, but with one of its delicate wings cleanly snapped off. She let out a small, sharp gasp, the first sound he had ever heard her make, and snatched it up with a desperate quickness, clutching it to her chest as if it were a living thing. For a fleeting, unguarded moment, Elias saw a look of pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes, a glimpse into a past so painful it stole her breath. Then, just as quickly, the mask of impassivity slammed back down. He didn't ask. He already knew it was the key to a door in her past he had no right to open. His ranch was his fortress, a spread of 200 acres where the fences were designed to keep the world out, not just his cattle in. He helped her down from the wagon, and she surveyed the stark, functional homestead, the simple cabin, the sturdy barn, the endless prairie, not with fear, but with an unnerving, assessing gaze. Inside the small, clean kitchen, he stoked the dying embers in the hearth. After a supper of beans and biscuits eaten in a silence so profound he could hear the blood in his own ears, he took a piece of chalk from a drawer. He tapped the rough-hewn table, getting her attention, and mouthed the word slowly. Name. She watched his lips, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then, she took the chalk from his fingers. In a soft, slanted script that seemed far too elegant for her ragged appearance, she wrote a single word on the dark wood of the table. Cora. The name seemed to fill the quiet space between them, a small island of identity in an ocean of unspoken things. Elias rose before dawn the next morning, the weight of Blackwood's threat a cold knot in his stomach. He walked toward the barn to check on the new mare, his mind racing through old deeds and his father's questionable dealings. He stopped dead in the doorway, concealed by the deep morning shadows. The bay mare was agitated, shifting nervously from foot to foot, refusing to put any weight on a front leg so swollen it looked twice its normal size. Cora was not near the animal. She was kneeling several feet away, her palm pressed flat against the dusty floorboards of the barn. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in a state of intense, almost painful concentration. Elias watched, completely baffled, as the horse's frantic, shallow breathing began to slow and deepen. The panicked rolling of its eyes ceased. It let out a low, shuddering snort, turned its head, and looked directly at Cora. Only then, after that silent communion, did she rise, moving with a fluid, unhurried grace. She approached the wounded animal, and as she placed her hands directly on the swollen, inflamed leg, the mare, which should have kicked or bolted from the sheer agony of the touch, stood perfectly still, submitting to her with a trust that defied all logic. Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had faced down grudges, fought the unforgiving land, and wrestled with the ghosts of his own bloodline. But he knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that he had brought something home that was far wilder, far more mysterious, and perhaps far more dangerous than any of them. He had brought home a girl who heard the world in a way he couldn't possibly comprehend. The morning after his discovery in the barn, Elias Thorne moved with a caution that was foreign to him. The world, which had always been a thing of hard certainties, rock, soil, sun, and rain, now held a shimmering, unnerving mystery at its very center, and that mystery was currently humming softly as she stirred a pot of oats over the fire. He did not confront her. Accusation felt like a clumsy, inadequate tool for what he had witnessed. Instead, after his morning chores, he entered the barn not as a master, but as an observer. Cora was already there, crouched beside the bay mare. The horse's leg was still terribly swollen, but its eyes were calm, and it stood patiently as Cora gently applied a poultice of crushed herbs he didn't recognize. He watched for a long moment, then stepped forward, holding out a bucket of clean water and a roll of fresh linen bandages. He didn't speak. He simply offered. Cora looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face for judgment or fear. Finding none, only a quiet, questioning gravity, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and accepted his offering. In that silent exchange, the first bricks of a new language were laid between them, a language built not on sound, but on shared purpose and mutual observation. In the days that followed, this language flourished in the quiet spaces of the ranch. Elias learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her hands would still when she sensed a change in the weather long before the clouds gathered. Cora, in turn, learned the rhythm of his life, anticipating his needs with an almost supernatural prescience. A hot cup of coffee would be waiting as he came in from the cold. A tool he needed would be cleaned and set out before he thought to ask for it. She moved through his house with a quiet efficiency that began to transform it. Dust vanished from corners that had been forgotten for years. The scent of baking bread sometimes replaced the stale air of solitude. The ranch, once merely his fortress against the world, began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home, a change so gradual and profound it unsettled him as much as it comforted him. But comfort was a luxury he could not afford. The shadow of Caleb Blackwood's threat loomed large, a poison that tainted the fragile peace. Elias knew that ignoring it would be tantamount to surrender. His initial plan was direct, the only way a man like him knew how to operate. Confront the problem head-on. He would ride into Redemption, go to the county clerk's office, and inspect the land deeds and ledgers himself. He would find the lie in Blackwood's claim and expose it. As he prepared to leave, saddling his oldest, most reliable gelding, Cora came out of the cabin. She held his saddlebags, which she had packed with a canteen of fresh water and a parcel of bread and dried meat. As she handed them to him, her fingers brushed his sleeve, and she held on for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. He looked down at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes conveyed a clear, urgent warning. She could feel the coiled danger waiting for him in town, the nest of hornets he was about to kick. He simply nodded, swung himself into the saddle, and rode out, the weight of her silent concern following him down the long, dusty road. In Redemption, the hostility was a palpable thing. Men who once gave him a curt nod now looked away. At the county clerk's office, a squat, brick building that smelled of aging paper and stale sweat, he met his first true obstacle. The clerk, a balding man named Abernathy with shifty eyes and ink-stained fingers, suddenly couldn't seem to find the Thorne property ledgers. A terrible misfiling, he mumbled, avoiding Elias's gaze. I'm sure they'll turn up. Perhaps next week. When Elias insisted, Abernathy's face paled. Mr. Blackwood's legal counsel has already requested all documents pertaining to that parcel for a historical review, he stammered. My hands are tied. The law, Elias was discovering, was a weapon that could be aimed. Frustrated and cold with anger, He crossed the street to the sheriff's office. Brody was at his desk, staring into a cup of cold coffee. He listened to Elias's story without surprise. "I warned you, Elias," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Blackwood isn't breaking the law. He's bending it into a pretzel. He's hired some slick lawyer from Austin, a man who can make a legal document sing any tune he wants. They're claiming an ancestral debt, tied to a pre-war land grant they say your father illegally voided." "It's a lie," Elias stated, his voice flat. "Proving it's a lie is the expensive part," Brody countered, finally looking up. "My advice? Get a lawyer of your own." The sheriff knew as well as Elias did that the Thorne Ranch, while land-rich, was cash-poor. A protracted legal battle against a man with Blackwood's resources was a war he was destined to lose. The system, the very law Brody was sworn to uphold, was already allied against him. While Elias was facing a wall of bureaucratic hostility in town, Blackwood made his next move, a clear message that his attack would not be confined to paper and ink. One of his men, a brutish ranch hand Elias recognized from the saloon, rode out to the Thorne property. He didn't approach the house directly. Instead, he made a slow, deliberate circuit of the fence line, a predator marking his territory. He stopped at the northern pasture, dismounted, and with a few powerful swings of a hammer, snapped a support post and cut the wires, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander out toward the arid scrubland. He never laid eyes on Cora, but his presence was a violation, a clear act of intimidation designed to terrorize any sane person left alone on the isolated ranch. But Cora was not just any person. She had felt his approach long before he was visible, a sour, malevolent ripple in the fabric of the day. She did not hide or panic. She simply stepped out onto the cabin's small porch, a broom still in her hand, and watched him. Her stillness was absolute, her gaze direct and unwavering. She did not project fear, only a profound and unnerving curiosity. The man, who had expected screams or a frantic retreat, found himself unnerved by her silence. He finished his work, but he did so with a haste that hadn't been there before, casting nervous glances toward the small, unmoving figure on the porch. He mounted his horse and rode off, feeling as though he were the one being watched, not the other way around. When Elias returned hours later, his mood was as black as thunder, his frustration from town curdling into a simmering rage. The sight of the broken fence and scattered cattle nearly sent him over the edge. He stormed toward the cabin, expecting to find Cora barricaded inside, terrified. Instead, he found her calmly kneading dough on the kitchen table. She looked up as he entered, and seeing the fury on his face and the dust on his clothes, she simply wiped her hands, picked up the piece of chalk, and wrote a single, clear word on the table. Weak. Elias stared at the word, confused. What? He thought she was referring to him, to his failure in town. But Cora shook her head gently and pointed out the window, in the direction the man had fled. She was not talking about him. She was talking about the intruder. In her eyes, a man who had to resort to such petty vandalism to feel powerful was not a threat to be feared, but a weakness to be pitied. The sheer, unexpected strength of her perspective cut through Elias's anger, leaving him speechless. The shared threat, instead of driving them apart, began to forge a bond stronger than steel. That evening, as Elias worked tirelessly to mend the fence before darkness fell, his fury slowly burning away and leaving only a grim resolve, Cora came to him. She carried a dipper of cool water from the well. He drank deeply, the water soothing the dust in his throat. He looked at her, at the quiet determination in her face, and found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He talked. He spoke of his frustration with the law, of the suffocating weight of his father's reputation, of the bitter irony of fighting for a piece of land that felt more like a prison than a home. He knew she couldn't hear the words, the sounds themselves, but he spoke anyway, needing to give voice to the demons that plagued him. Cora stood before him and listened, not with her ears, but with her entire being. She watched the hard lines of his face, the clenching of his jaw, the exhaustion in his shoulders. She felt the shape of his pain. When his voice finally trailed off into the vast silence of the prairie, she did something that reached across the divide between them. She stepped forward and placed her small, calloused hand flat against his chest, right over his heart, holding it there for a long, steady moment. It was not a gesture of pity or romance, but of profound, absolute understanding. In that single touch, Elias felt a lifetime of solitude crack. He wasn't alone in his struggle. That night, fueled by a new and unfamiliar sense of hope, he lit a lantern and entered his father's dusty, neglected office. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound crate filled with his father's papers. He would not be beaten by a lie. He would sift through every piece of paper, every brittle deed and faded bill of sale, until he found the truth. But as the hours bled into days, the search yielded nothing but a deeper understanding of his father's ruthlessness. There were IOUs from ruined men, contracts skewed in his favor, and letters that spoke of a cold, hard ambition. There was no single document, no clear title that could unequivocally refute Blackwood's claim. While his hope dwindled, the bay mare in the barn, under Cora's patient care, was thriving. Her leg was healing at a miraculous pace. The small, daily miracle of her recovery was a stark and painful contrast to his own failing efforts. On the 5th day of his search, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, a rider approached the ranch. It wasn't one of Blackwood's thugs. It was a young deputy from Sheriff Brody's office. The boy looked uncomfortable as he dismounted and handed Elias an official-looking document, sealed with the county's wax stamp. Elias's hands felt cold as he broke the seal. The words, written in a lawyer's precise, merciless script, leaped off the page. It was a notice of lien and foreclosure, formally and legally filed by Caleb Blackwood against the Thorne property. The ticking clock was no longer a threat. It was now official. He had 60 days to produce a verified counterclaim or pay a sum of money so exorbitant it might as well have been the moon. His initial plan, to use the law to fight for his rights, had not only failed, it had been turned into a weapon against him. He stood there, the paper trembling in his hand, the world shrinking to that single, damning document. He looked up and saw Cora standing in the cabin doorway, her face illuminated by the lamplight. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a grim, sorrowful certainty. She had known this was coming. He was no longer just fighting for his land. He was a fly caught in a web, and the spider was finally coming to collect. The 60-day deadline on the foreclosure notice was not just a measure of time, it was a physical weight that settled upon Elias Thorne's shoulders, pressing him down into the very earth he was struggling to keep. The fragile peace Cora had cultivated within the cabin walls evaporated under the heat of his simmering desperation. He spent his days in a futile cycle of labor and despair, mending fences that felt temporary and poring over his father's old papers at night until the words blurred into meaningless symbols of his own failure. The crate of documents was not a source of hope, but a tombstone marking the sins of his lineage, offering no absolution and no legal ammunition. Caleb Blackwood, meanwhile, was not a man to sit idle and wait for the law to run its course. He began to apply pressure in ways that were both insidious and impossible to prove. The small creek that ran along the northern edge of Elias's property, the lifeblood for his modest herd, began to shrink. Its steady flow trickled down to a sluggish, muddy stream. Elias knew, with a certainty that churned in his gut, that Blackwood had constructed a dam or diversion further upstream, slowly strangling his land, starving his cattle. It was a cruel, quiet act of war, demonstrating a power that operated beyond the reach of any sheriff. The cattle grew thin, their lowing taking on a plaintive, thirsty edge that grated on Elias's already frayed nerves. The pressure began to poison the silent sanctuary he and Cora had built. He grew withdrawn, his face locked in a permanent scowl, and a harsh, angry silence replaced the comfortable quiet they had once shared. He saw the worry in Cora's eyes, but he had no room for her gentle solace. His fight was loud, brutal, and internal, and her profound stillness began to feel like a reproach, a lack of understanding of the sheer violence of their situation. The rift between them culminated on a blisteringly hot afternoon by the nearly dry well. He was wrestling with the failing hand pump, his knuckles raw and bleeding, his shirt soaked with sweat and frustration. Cora approached him quietly, holding out a clean cloth and a dipper of water. Without thinking, he lashed out, his voice a raw rasp. "What good will that do? This can't be fixed with a gentle touch." He knocked the dipper from her hand, the precious water splashing into the dust. The moment the words left his mouth, he was filled with a wave of self-loathing. Cora flinched, not in fear, but in pain. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a sorrow that was not for herself, but for him. She saw the man drowning in his own rage. Without a word, she turned and walked back to the cabin, the space between them now a chasm of unspoken hurt. That night, as if summoned by the turmoil on the ground, the sky broke open. A Texas thunderstorm of biblical proportions descended upon the ranch. The wind howled like a grieving beast, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. It was a perfect mirror for the tempest raging inside Elias's soul. He stood on the porch, watching the sky wage war on his land, feeling a bitter kinship with its fury. Then, with a deafening crack that seemed to split the world in two, a bolt of lightning dropped from the heavens and struck the ancient, gnarled oak tree that stood sentinel beside the cabin, the same tree under which his mother had been buried. The oak exploded in a shower of sparks, its massive trunk erupting into an inferno. The fire, fed by the wind, began to lick greedily toward the barn, where the terrified animals screamed and thrashed. Primal instinct took over. Elias grabbed an axe and a bucket and charged into the maelstrom, a frantic, hopeless one-man army against an elemental enemy. He was all rage and desperation, hacking at burning branches, throwing useless buckets of water against a wall of flame. It was his fight against Blackwood, his fight against his father's legacy, all made real in fire and smoke. In the midst of his chaos, Cora moved with a terrifying, otherworldly calm. While he fought the fire, she was saving the life. She threw open the corral gate and walked into the heart of the panic. She moved through the terrified horses and cattle, not with commands, but with her presence alone, a silent, steady anchor in the storm. She laid her hands on the trembling flanks of the mare, guiding it out, and the others followed her lead. She led them away from the fire, down into a low-lying pasture where the driving rain would protect them. Her actions were a stark contrast to his. His were born of furious desperation, hers of profound, focused purpose. The fire raged through the night, but the rain finally won. By dawn, the world was a landscape of steam and devastation. The barn was saved, but the ancient oak was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. Elias stood before it, covered in soot and sweat, hollowed out by exhaustion and defeat. The storm had passed, but his problems remained. The tree, his last link to his mother's memory, was gone. As he stared at the ruin, his eyes caught something amidst the wreckage. The lightning bolt had not just burned the tree, it had shattered it, splitting the massive trunk down to its core and blasting the earth away from its roots. And there, nestled in a hollow among the gnarled, exposed roots, was a dark, rectangular shape. It was an old leather satchel, rotted and scorched, but miraculously intact. His heart pounding, he pried it from the earth. The leather crumbled in his fingers as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in a surprisingly well-preserved oilcloth, were two items. The first was a small, heavy silver locket, tarnished black with age. The second was a ledger. It was not his father's. The handwriting was different, more elegant. He clicked open the locket. On one side was a miniature portrait of a solemn, dark-haired woman. On the other, a portrait of a young boy with his father's same cold, calculating eyes. A boy who could only be Caleb Blackwood. He walked back to the cabin, the satchel's contents in his hands. Cora was waiting by the door. He held out the locket, and as she took it, a tremor ran through her. She traced the woman's face with her finger, and her own face, usually so composed, became a canvas of conflicting emotions, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of pain, a deep, ancient sorrow. The connection was there, real and undeniable, though Elias could not yet fathom its meaning. He sat at the table, his hands trembling slightly, and opened the ledger. It was not a book of accounts, but a journal, and the first entry sent a jolt of ice through his veins. The journal belonged to Josiah Blackwood, Caleb's father. It was a meticulous record of his dealings with a man he described as a wolf in gentleman's clothing. Elias's own father, Marcus Thorne. Elias read, his world falling away page by page, the carefully constructed image of his father disintegrating into that of a monster. The journal detailed how Marcus Thorne had systematically cheated and threatened Josiah, but the final entries revealed the true, horrific secret of the land. They hadn't been arguing over a deed or a debt. They had been arguing over water rights to the very creek Caleb was now strangling. On a hot summer's night 20 years ago, at that very creek, Marcus Thorne had not argued with Josiah Blackwood. He had murdered him, striking him from behind and staging it to look like a drunken fall into the rocky creek bed. The legal transfer of the land had been coerced from Josiah's terrified, grieving widow a month later. The foreclosure was not about a debt. It was about a blood debt. This was never about land. It was about vengeance. Elias looked down at the journal, at the proof of a sin far greater than he had ever imagined. His shame was no longer a vague inheritance. It was a specific, horrific crime. In that moment, everything shifted. He was no longer a man reacting, desperately trying to defend a piece of land. He was a man holding the key to the entire conflict. The journal was not a shield. It was a weapon. He couldn't take it to Sheriff Brody. It was one dead man's word against another, and it would only destroy his family name for nothing. But he could take it to Caleb. The fight was no longer about saving his legacy. It was about confronting it. He had to end the cycle of violence and lies his father had begun. For the first time since the notice arrived, he had a purpose. He was no longer on the defensive. He was going on the attack. Dawn broke over the ravaged landscape of the Thorne Ranch, its gentle light illuminating a world scarred by fire and truth. Elias sat at the kitchen table, the leather-bound journal of Josiah Blackwood open before him, its pages filled with a dead man's elegant script, detailing a crime that had poisoned the very soil beneath his feet. The discovery had not brought the righteous fire of impending victory he might have hoped for. Instead, it had hollowed him out, replacing his anger with a profound and bottomless shame. His entire life had been a struggle against the shadow of his father, Marcus Thorne, and now he knew the true, monstrous nature of that shadow. It was the ghost of a murderer. He was no longer fighting for land or legacy. He was shackled to a sin, and the weight of it was crushing. In the midst of this spiritual reckoning, the memory of his harsh words to Cora returned to him, a fresh wound on top of an old one. He had pushed away the only person who had ever seen past the Thorne name to the man beneath. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he could not face this new, terrible reality alone. He found her in the barn, where the scent of hay and healing herbs mingled in the cool morning air. She was brushing the bay mare's coat, her movements slow and rhythmic, a small island of peace in his world of turmoil. He didn't speak. Words felt clumsy, tainted. Instead, he walked to a large, smooth wooden beam, picked up the piece of chalk from a nearby ledge, and in large, stark letters, wrote a single word. Sorry. He stepped back. Cora stopped her brushing, her eyes fixed on the word. A long moment passed, the only sound the soft swish of the horse's tail. Then, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an absolution. He walked to her side and held out the open journal, then the silver locket. He couldn't explain the decades of deceit written in the book, but he could share its burden. He pointed to the name Marcus Thorne, then to Josiah Blackwood, his finger tracing the damning narrative. He then opened the locket, revealing the faces of the woman and the young boy. He was not just showing her evidence, he was confessing the sins of his house. Cora looked from the book to the locket, and then to Elias's haunted face. She could not read the words, but she didn't need to. She could feel the generations of pain radiating from the objects, the bitter chill of betrayal and violence. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the open journal, a silent vow of solidarity. The chasm between them was closed. They were a united front once more, not against a legal claim, but against the darkness of the past. Back in the cabin, they began to formulate a new plan, born from the ashes of the old one. Elias knew now that the journal was not a key, but a map. Taking it to Sheriff Brody would be useless. It was hearsay, a dead man's diary against the reputation of one of the county's founding families. Confronting Caleb with it directly would be suicide. Caleb would simply kill him to bury the secret forever. They needed something undeniable, something the law, even a bent one, could not ignore. Their attention turned back to the locket. Cora held it, her fingers tracing the intricate floral carvings on its surface. As she did, Elias noticed something he had missed in his initial shock. A tiny, almost invisible inscription etched along the inner rim. He leaned closer, angling it to the light. The words were faint, but clear. My Cora, my light. Elias's blood ran cold. He looked from the inscription to the woman in the cabin, the woman who shared that name. It couldn't be a coincidence. The woman in the locket, Josiah Blackwood's wife. Was she Cora's grandmother? Did that make the boy in the locket, a young Caleb, her cousin? Suddenly, a flood of disconnected pieces slammed into place. Her mysterious past, the look of pained recognition, the broken wooden bird. Was it a childhood toy? Perhaps even a gift from Caleb, from a time before their families were sundered by violence? The trauma that had stolen her voice. Was it a direct consequence of Marcus Thorne's brutality, a horror so profound it had shattered her world and silenced her forever? The fight was no longer just his. It was hers, too. It was for her stolen family, her stolen voice. Fueled by this intensely personal new stake, Elias turned back to the journal, searching not for narrative, but for a clue. His eyes scanned the final, desperate entries of Josiah Blackwood. And then he found it. A passage written in a shaky hand spoke of his deep distrust of banks and of a final contingency hidden away. Josiah wrote, "Should the wolf succeed, everything of value, the original Spanish land grant, my deeds, my last reserves, is secured. He will own the dirt, but not the right. It lies beneath the silent watcher, where the two rivers once met." Elias's heart hammered in his chest. The silent watcher. It was a cryptic clue, but it was a clue nonetheless. And he knew the place. The Blackwood property, miles upstream, was situated near a unique geological formation. A tall, solitary rock spire that old settlers called the Watcher, overlooking a dry valley where two ancient riverbeds converged. The original deed, the irrefutable proof that could dismantle Caleb's entire legal case, was not lost to time. It was hidden in a strongbox, buried on Caleb Blackwood's own land. The plan formed in his mind, audacious and terrifyingly dangerous. They would not use the journal as evidence. They would use it as a treasure map. They would infiltrate the Blackwood ranch and steal back the proof that had been buried for 20 years. It was a fool's errand, a criminal act in the eyes of the law, but it was the only path left. To do this, however, he needed a diversion. He couldn't simply sneak onto the most heavily guarded ranch in the county. Swallowing his pride, he rode to town one last time, his destination the office of the one man who existed in the gray space between the law and justice. Sheriff Brody. Elias found Brody cleaning his pistol, a task the sheriff seemed to perform whenever he was troubled. Elias didn't show him the journal. He knew Brody couldn't officially act on such a thing. Instead, he laid out a partial truth. "Sheriff," he began, his voice low and steady, "you know Blackwood is choking my creek. That's illegal. I also have reason to believe he's storing illegally acquired property on his ranch, things tied to the old land dispute." He let that hang in the air. "I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm asking you to enforce the law." Brody stopped cleaning his gun. "What do you want, Elias?" "Tomorrow night, there's a full moon. I want you to ride out to Blackwood's property. Ride to the northern edge, by the creek. Go to inspect his illegal dam. Make a show of it. Bring a deputy. Your presence will be noted." Brody stared at him, understanding the unspoken request. Elias wasn't asking for help. He was asking for a distraction. It was a risky proposition, asking the law to be an unwitting accomplice to a potential crime. But Brody had seen the look in Elias's eyes, the quiet desperation of a man pushed too far. He had also seen the smug arrogance of Caleb Blackwood, a man who believed he was above the law. 1 hour, Elias, Brody said finally, his voice a low grumble. I'll give you 1 hour, starting at 10 o'clock. After that, you're on your own. It was more than Elias had hoped for. The following night, the moon rose, huge and luminous, bathing the harsh landscape in a treacherous, silvery light. In the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Elias checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded. Cora moved about the kitchen, wrapping bread and filling a canteen. When he was ready, he turned to her, holding out a skinning knife. "Just in case," he said softly. She looked at the knife, then shook her head. She turned to the hearth, her eyes landing on the heavy, black cast-iron skillet she used every day. She picked it up, testing its weight. It was a practical, formidable, and deeply unexpected choice. It was not the weapon of a victim, but the tool of a survivor. In her hands, it was a statement. She would not be protected. She would fight alongside him. They rode out not as a rancher and a refugee, but as partners, equals in a desperate gamble. They used the deep shadows of the canyons to mask their approach, the sounds of their horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. Soon, they saw it in the distance. A cluster of lights burning defiantly in the vast darkness. The Blackwood Ranch. As they drew closer, tethering their horses in a grove of cottonwoods, they heard the distinct sound of angry shouting carrying on the night wind, coming from the direction of the creek. Sheriff Brody had kept his word. The diversion had begun. Elias and Cora slipped through the final wire fence, their boots making no sound on the damp earth. They crouched behind a low stone wall, the main ranch house now just 100 yards away. The game was afoot. They were trespassers, thieves in the night, searching for a dead man's treasure on enemy soil. If they were caught, they would not be arrested. They would be shot, their bodies buried where they fell, with no law to protect them and no one to tell their story. This was it. There was no turning back. It was all or nothing. The air on the Blackwood Ranch was still and cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and sagebrush. Under the spectral light of the full moon, Elias and Cora moved like ghosts through the shadows, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The shouts from the creek, where Sheriff Brody was playing his part, were growing fainter, a stark reminder of their rapidly closing window of opportunity. The sprawling ranch house stood before them, a dark monolith representing a generation of stolen prosperity. Elias scanned the landscape, searching for the silent watcher from the journal, his eyes drawn to the large, obvious rock formations on the horizon. But it was Cora who found it. She tugged on his sleeve, her gaze fixed not on the grand landscape, but on a small, neglected corner of the property near the main house. There, almost completely swallowed by a tangle of overgrown ivy and shadows, stood a weathered stone angel, its face streaked with years of grime, its hands clasped in perpetual prayer. It was a grave marker, watching over a forgotten family cemetery. The clue had not been geographical, it had been sentimental. This was the silent watcher. They scrambled into the enclosure, the names on the weathered headstones confirming their discovery. Josiah Blackwood, and beside him, a smaller stone for his wife, Elspeth. This was the heart of the secret. At the foot of the angel statue, in a small clearing where the lines of two ancient, dry riverbeds converged, the earth was slightly sunken. There was no time for finesse. Elias pulled a small trowel from his saddlebag and they began to dig, clawing at the hard, rocky soil with the trowel and their bare hands. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot, every rustle of the leaves a phantom footstep. The shouts from the creek had faded completely now. Their time was up. Just as Elias's fingers scraped against the cold, unyielding metal of a strongbox, the warm lights of the ranch house windows blazed to life, pinning them in a sudden, harsh glare. A voice, dripping with triumphant irony, echoed from the porch. "Looking for something, Thorne?" Caleb Blackwood stood there, a Winchester rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. From the shadows of the barn and the bunkhouse, his men emerged, their own guns leveled, effectively surrounding the small cemetery. There was no escape. Brody was gone. The diversion was over. A cold dread washed over Elias as he realized the truth. This wasn't a lucky discovery. It was a perfectly executed trap. "You found my father's journal in that old tree, didn't you?" Caleb said, stepping down from the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "I saw your tracks a few days ago. I didn't know what you'd found, but I knew it was something important. So I decided to let you lead me right to it. I have to thank you. I've been searching for this box for years." He gestured with his rifle. "Open it." Defeated, Elias pried the rusted lid off the strongbox. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed papers, was the original Spanish land grant, its wax seal still intact. It was the true, undeniable deed to all this land. Caleb let out a low, satisfied laugh. He now possessed the lie, the coerced deed from Elias's father, and the truth, the original grant. And the only two people who knew the whole story were kneeling in a grave, entirely at his mercy. His victory was absolute. He took the deed from Elias's hands, his eyes finally settling on Cora. His expression shifted from triumph to a complex mixture of contempt and a flicker of something that looked almost like pain. "And you," he sneered, his voice losing its smooth edge. "The lost lamb. I often wondered if Marcus Thorne had managed to kill all of you." He looked back at Elias, his eyes burning with a hatred that was centuries deep. "You want to know the truth, Thorne? Her father was my father's younger brother. This is her land as much as it is mine. After your father murdered mine, he didn't stop there. He used his money and his thugs to ruin and drive off every last Blackwood to secure his stolen claim. Her father, a good man, was broken by it, turned to drink. And her?" He gestured cruelly at Cora. "The last time I saw her, she was a little girl, screaming in a barn while one of your father's men held her mother against a wall. That's what stole her voice, Thorne. Not some random act of God. The work of your bloodline." The revelation struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Cora, at the unspeakable pain that now made sense, at the profound horror of her past. He wasn't her savior. He was the son of her tormentor, living on the land soaked in her family's blood. He was the final, walking insult to her entire existence. "So you see," Caleb continued, raising his rifle and aiming it squarely at Elias's chest, "this is justice. I'll kill you both. Bury you right here with my father. A thief and his silent witch, caught in the act. It's a clean story. He had won. The journal meant nothing. The deed was his, and his revenge was at hand." The world seemed to slow down. Elias saw the tightening of Caleb's finger on the trigger. But in that frozen moment, as Caleb prepared to fire, something broke within Cora, A sound tore from her throat, a sound she hadn't made in over a decade. It was not a word, but a low, keening cry of pure, concentrated agony, a howl of grief and rage that had been locked away in silence for years. The raw, inhuman sound was so unexpected it startled everyone, making Caleb flinch for a single, vital heartbeat. In that heartbeat, Cora moved. With a speed born of pure survival instinct, she swung the heavy cast-iron skillet she had been clutching. The skillet connected with the barrel of Caleb's Winchester with a sickening clang. The rifle fired, the shot going wide, splintering the head of the stone angel and sending shards of rock into the air. All hell broke loose. Elias launched himself at Caleb, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled for the rifle, a desperate, grunting struggle in the dirt of the grave. The ranch hands surged forward, but Cora did not cower. She held the skillet like a shield, a wild, protective fury in her eyes, a silent sentinel standing over the struggling men. Just as one of the hands raised his own pistol to shoot Elias in the back, another gunshot, louder and sharper, echoed through the night. The ranch hand cried out, clutching his shoulder as his gun fell to the ground. At the edge of the cemetery, his own pistol smoking, stood Sheriff Brody. He hadn't left. He had circled back, his conscience and his suspicion getting the better of him. "Drop it! Caleb!" Brody commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of the law for the first time. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Elias wrenched the rifle from Caleb's grasp, pinning him to the ground. The other ranch hand, seeing the sheriff, raised his hands in surrender. The tension shattered, replaced by the heavy panting of the combatants and the sudden, deafening chirping of crickets. Brody walked forward, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. He picked up the fallen Spanish deed, then the journal which had tumbled out of Elias's coat. He looked down at the sputtering, defeated Caleb Blackwood, then over at Elias and Cora, who stood together, battered but unbroken. "Caleb," the sheriff said, his voice flat and final, "it looks like you and I are going to have a very long talk." The confrontation was over. The immediate danger had passed. Caleb was captured. The truth was in the hands of the law, and against all odds, Elias and Cora were still standing. The ride back to the Thorne Ranch, as dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gray, was steeped in a silence unlike any they had ever shared. It was not the empty silence of strangers, nor the tense silence of unspoken conflict, but a profound, resonant quiet filled with the echoes of shared trauma and the exhausted relief of survival. They were two halves of a whole, bonded together not by words, but by the fire and truth they had walked through in the long, dark night. When they finally reached the familiar outline of the cabin and the barn, the property looked the same, yet everything was fundamentally different. The ranch was no longer a fortress where Elias hid from the world, nor a prison defined by his father's sins. It was simply home, a piece of earth they had fought for and sanctified with their courage. Inside, the world shrank to the small, intimate gestures of care. Elias, his hands surprisingly gentle, cleaned a shallow cut on Cora's arm from a piece of flying rock. She, in turn, pressed a cool, damp cloth to a darkening bruise on his cheekbone. In the quiet aftermath, their silent language evolved once more, imbued with a new depth of intimacy and understanding. He now knew the history behind the haunted look that sometimes entered her eyes, and she had felt the full, crushing weight of the legacy he carried. They were no longer a mystery to one another. In his mind, he thought of her not just as Cora, but as Cora Blackwood, and the name, which should have represented a bitter enmity, felt like the missing piece of a puzzle he never knew he was solving. In the weeks that followed, the story of that night at the Blackwood Cemetery rippled through redemption, shattering the town's foundational myths. Sheriff Brody, armed with Josiah Blackwood's journal and the original Spanish land grant, had done his duty with a newfound, unwavering resolve. Caleb Blackwood was charged with attempted murder, extortion, and a litany of other crimes, his reign of influence and fear broken permanently. The trial would be a formality. The townsfolk, including Deacon Miller and those who had once gathered with torches, were forced into a shamefaced silence, confronted with the ugly truth that they had been pawns in a vengeful man's game, eager to condemn a girl for being different while ignoring the true evil festering in their midst. The Thorne name was now inextricably linked with murder, and the Blackwood name with a bitter, all-consuming vengeance. Elias knew he could not build a future on such poisoned ground. One crisp autumn morning, he rode into town, not as a recluse, but as a man with a purpose. He met with Sheriff Brody and a traveling circuit judge, and in a quiet, deliberate act of atonement, he laid the truth on the table. Using the original deed as the sole legal document, he formally dissolved the Thorne family's claim to the land, effectively erasing the century of lies his father had built. Then, he filed a new claim. The ranch was reborn, no longer bearing the tainted name of a single family, but christened with a name that spoke of its geography and its future. Two Rivers Ranch. In a second, legally binding document, he deeded 50% of this new ranch to Cora Blackwood, making her his equal partner in the eyes of the law. It was no longer his land to protect, nor her land to reclaim. It was, finally and forever, their land, a new world built not on blood and deceit, but on shared truth. With the external war won, the quiet, internal healing could begin. Life on Two Rivers Ranch fell into a new rhythm, one of peace and growth. The creek, its illegal dam dismantled, once again flowed freely, and the parched land drank deeply, its grasses turning a lush, hopeful green. The change in Elias was profound. The crushing weight of his father's legacy, a burden he had carried since childhood, was lifted. He was no longer defined by the sins of Marcus Thorne, but by his own actions to rectify them. He began to mend fences not just on his property, but with the world, exchanging quiet greetings with neighbors who now looked at him with a mixture of awe and respect. But the most miraculous healing was that of Cora. In the unshakable safety of the ranch, in the steady, unwavering love of the man beside her, the deep wounds of her past began to close. The silence that had been her shield and her prison for so long began to recede. It did not happen all at once. It started with small, unconscious sounds, a soft hum as she brushed the horses, a quiet sigh of contentment as she watched the sunset. She began to garden, and Elias would often hear her making small, soft noises to the budding plants, a language of pure, gentle encouragement. The true miracle came one evening as they sat on the porch they had rebuilt together. It had become their ritual to sit there after supper, watching the stars ignite in the vast, velvet sky. Elias had taken to reading aloud to her from an old book of poems, not caring if she heard the sounds, but simply wanting to share the beauty of the words. He was reading a line about the resilience of the prairie grass when he stumbled over a difficult word, pausing. In the quiet that followed, a voice, soft and raspy from years of disuse, spoke into the darkness. "Perennial," she said. The word was perfectly formed, a miracle whispered into the night air. Elias froze, his heart seeming to stop in his chest. He turned to look at her. Cora was looking back at him, a small, shy smile on her lips, the starlight reflected in her tear-filled eyes. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him. He didn't weep or exclaim. He simply reached out, took her hand, and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. He understood. Her voice was not a necessity for them. Their language of the heart was already perfect. But it was a choice, a gift, a final, beautiful reclamation of a part of herself that had been stolen. A year passed, and spring returned to the Two Rivers Ranch, more vibrant than ever before. The bay mare, now sleek and healthy, grazed peacefully in the pasture with a spirited young foal by her side. The fields were green, the air was clean, and the world felt new. One Sunday morning, Elias and Cora walked hand in hand to the small, restored cemetery, no longer a place of confrontation, but of peace. They had commissioned a new headstone for Josiah and Elspeth Blackwood, and right beside the cleaned, repaired stone angel, they had placed a simple, elegant marker for Elias's mother, finally uniting the two families in a quiet, sun-dappled truce. Cora's voice, when she chose to use it, was still quiet, reserved for moments of particular importance or simple affection. Her silence was no longer a wound, but a part of her strength, a place of deep listening from which her wisdom sprang. As they stood on the hill overlooking their home, she turned to him, her face full of a light that outshone the morning sun. "Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady. He turned to her, and in her eyes he saw his own reflection, that of a man no longer haunted, a man made whole. They didn't need to say anything more. They had faced down the ghosts of the past and the hatred of the present, and had built a future from love, truth, and forgiveness. They had discovered that the most profound conversations are not spoken aloud, and that true redemption is not found in a town's name, but in the quiet, steadfast beating of another's heart next to your own. In the vast, wind-swept plains of the American West, where legacies are forged in dust and blood, the story of Elias Thorne and Cora Blackwood became a quiet legend. It was never a tale merely of land disputes or violent revenge, but a testament to a love that found its voice in the most profound of silences. A man haunted by the sins of his father, and a woman silenced by the trauma of her past. They began as two solitary souls adrift in a harsh world. Yet, in the quiet spaces between them, they built a language without words, a bond forged through shared glances, intuitive gestures, and the steadfast courage to face the darkness together. Their journey teaches us a powerful lesson. True healing comes not from burying the past, but from unearthing its truths, however painful, and choosing to plant a new future in that broken ground. It reminds us that the most essential form of listening is not done with the ears, but with the heart. It is the act of seeing another's pain and choosing to stand with them, of understanding their silence as clearly as any spoken word. The story of Two Rivers Ranch is a testament to the fact that even from the most poisoned soil of hatred and violence, something beautiful and resilient can grow. If their story of courage, atonement, and love that speaks the language of the soul has resonated with you, please help us share it with the world. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet strength, and subscribe to the Wild West Love Story channel for more tales where love is not just told, but felt. Share your own thoughts on Elias and Cora's journey in the comments below. Thank you for joining us, and may you always find someone who hears the music of your heart.